The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. The southeastern region of the United States occupies a thorny place in the American story. It's both geographically far from the Northeast and culturally far from the sense of Northeast elitism. Known within the country simply as the South, it is a region rich in culture with a troubled history stemming from a legacy of slavery and segregation. It has influenced American culture in profound ways, from literature to cuisine and music. It is the birthplace of jazz and the blues, which would one day evolve into rock and roll. Today, it is a hotbed of country music and has left a heavy mark on the world of hip-hop. However, it walks a very fine line when it comes to politics. In spite of a long history of conservative Democratic governors, the state of Georgia became a stronghold for Republicans in the early 2000s, much like the rest of its fellow southern states. Complicating the story, its capital city of Atlanta boasts a proud association with the civil rights movement and is famously the birthplace of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To boot, the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, is from Plains, Georgia. In American politics, red is usually depicted as the color of Republicans. But in the 2020 election, Georgia turned blue. The state voted for the Democratic candidate for president for the first time in almost 30 years, and it elected its first Jewish senator and its first African American senator, both Democrats. What were the demographic and cultural shifts required to make this happen? Political pundits remain divided 2 years later. Chuck Reece is a journalist who has worked in Georgia politics. In 2013, he founded a publication called The Bitter Southerner, which celebrates the culture of the South while also taking a good hard look at its troubled history. He eventually left the publication in 2020 and founded a new project in 2021 called Salvation South. This new venture would be focused on trying to bring people together in a divided nation over their love of Southern culture. The Global Detail spoke with Reece to find out how his experiences shaped his outlook and to get his take on the current political situation in America and what to do about it. From my reading, you started your professional career as a journalist in New York. So tell me, what is that like?
That's right.
What's that like for being a country boy from Ellijay, Georgia, and starting your career in New York, of all places?
Well, what happened to me was I was at the journalism school at the University of Georgia. And between my junior and senior years, I applied to an internship program that is run every year and still is an annual thing, run by the American Society of Magazine Editors. And they pick about 50 kids from journalism schools all over the country and assign them to about 50 different magazines and I was lucky enough to get into that program. And so I spent the summer between my junior and senior years of college in New York, on an internship, and I got hooked. And I just fell in love with the place, and which is, something that happens to a lot of people. And a lot of rural people, too, who go up there for the first time, because it's hard not to fall in love with New York, at least from my perspective. There's it's one of the few places you can live where you feel like you never miss anything. Anything you could possibly want to do is like right at your fingertips. And so I had that internship, and for that program, I got assigned to Advertising Age, which was a trade magazine that covered the advertising. When I got out of college after my senior year, their competitor, Adweek, had a job open in their Atlanta office, and the only job I ever got on the spot. And I walked in for the interview and they hired me because where else were they going to find somebody fresh out of journalism school who already had experience, covering the industry that they covered. And so I was with them in Atlanta for a year, and then they moved me to New York, and I was happy to be back. Stayed there for 5 years that first time.
Yeah. So how did that, coming from the South with all that baggage, I'm sure there was some degree of culture shock or the fish out of water thing. How does that kind of shape your cultural and political awareness, having done that time in New York?
Well, when I got up there, of course, I caught a lot of hell from people because I have a pretty thick accent, one that I've never really tried to get rid of, but I think it would be impossible to if I tried, and so, I caught some grief when I first got up there, but, it was funny. It was like once people figured out that, I could actually put a compound complex sentence together, they kind of gave me a break. And, I think New York made me, more than anything, it made me aware of what the wider world actually looked like. I had, I had grown up in the mountains of North Georgia in a place that was not, ethnically diverse at all. And then, had been in Athens, Georgia, which was slightly more diverse, but, the student population of the University of Georgia back then in the 80s was very skewed toward white folks. The campus is a lot more diverse place these days than it was back then. So, living in New York was the first time I had ever been in a place where I saw all kinds of people from all over the world, and, it was a great learning experience for me. Everything, I went up there and experienced so many things that were new to me that I never would have, experienced before. Everything from, arts, culture, food, it just, it made me feel like the scope of my life was not as limited as I had probably thought it was before. Which was a great feeling.
Yeah. Did it give you, a greater appreciation of being Southern? Because I get the feeling that you hear a lot of Americans talk. They have this idea that like America is like so generic and these other people have culture and we don't. But in the South, that has like a very well-defined culture that I think that where like people outside the region somewhat know about it. Did you kind of get that feeling going up there where suddenly like people like were you going in there and they've already got like assumptions about, where you're from and what, like the music you listen to and what you eat and all this other stuff?
And I realized that the only thing I could do in those situations was to try to show and explain to people why I was proud of my culture, even though, as all Southerners still have to do, you have to acknowledge the ugly parts of our region's history. And there are many ugly parts, and still are today, sadly. But, you got to make it clear to people that you acknowledge those things while at the same time you're proud of the culture you grew up with, and when folks would make fun of me, which happened quite often in that Adweek newsroom. You know, I would, you know, I would try to turn those things into learning opportunities. You know, like folks would call me hillbilly and they'd make jokes about moonshine and stuff like that. So I remember the first Christmas that I was in New York. I came home and, you know, the folks around where I grew up weren't known for making moonshine. They didn't make corn whiskey. They made apple brandy. And, you know, just as potent as corn liquor, but, you know, the mash was made out of apples, not grain. And, you know, I came back to New York with a pint mason jar full of apple brandy. And, you know, we closed the magazine down. It came out on Monday morning, and we closed it down every Friday night. And the first Friday night in January when I was back, I took the pint of apple brandy out of my bag, and I was like, okay, you know, y'all gather around. Got some of the little conical cups out of the water cooler and poured everybody who wanted one a shot, you know, and they drank it, and they were like, you know, they're like almost choking to death, you know, and you know, because the stuff tastes so wonderful and fragrant, you know, when you first put it in your mouth, and then it gets down to, you know, about mid sternum, and you feel like, you know, your whole body's on fire. And it was really funny because my editor at Adweek was a guy named Jeffrey Precourt, and that's Jeffrey with a Geoffrey spelling. And Jeffrey had grown up, you know, blue blood Bostonian. And when he saw me the next Monday morning, he called me to his desk and he said, Reece, I have no idea what was in that stuff you gave me on Friday night, but I wound up in a rental car in the Bronx at midnight, and I had no idea how I got there. And I was like, well, good for you, you know. And I would just, you know, I tried to own where I was from, you know, and I, you know, I think I probably changed a good many folks in that newsroom's ideas about Southern people and what they were like and what they were capable of. At least I hope it did.
Yeah. So tell us about founding the Bitter Southerner. I've read famously it actually started out as a cocktail blog.
You know, when the whole resurgence of classic cocktails happened, right? You know, I'd gotten kind of fascinated with it, and my then fiance and now wife and I had spent a week in New Orleans, you know, and we'd gone to several of the great old bars down there that had never stopped doing cocktails properly. And, you know, we'd had a very good time. And the week after we got home, I saw a thing, you know, pop up on my Facebook feed, I believe it was, about a list of the 50 top cocktail bars in the world done by a trade magazine called Drinks International. And, you know, I just opened the link because I thought, well, I bet, you know, one of those bars that we went to in New Orleans will be on this list. And not only were none of those New Orleans bars on the list, there wasn't a single bar in the American South on that list. And I was like, you know, it kind of pissed me off. And so, you know, I knew there were a lot of bartenders in the South who were, you know, really talented and doing really interesting things. And I had this idea that I would start a blog about it, and went to one of my colleagues at the design firm I was working at the time, and told him I had this idea for a blog. I asked him if he would design it, and that's kind of how it started. but we were trying to figure out what the name of the thing should be. And we started by, by sort of rolling down a list of things that go into cocktails: whiskey, citrus, syrups, all these things. And you're pairing them with, the word Southerner or South or stuff like that. And then when we got to bitters, and we were like, the bitter Southerner. And it was like, wow, that's like a triple entendre, and so it really, once we hit on that name, we kind of felt like the name was calling on us to do something bigger than just a cocktail bar, and we sort of took a year to figure it out. And, that's how the Bitter Southerner got started. It was probably a year after that, a year or a little more after that we actually launched the thing with the idea of doing, long-form journalism that was meant to debunk stereotypes about the South and Southern.
You guys went from, I think initially you were doing one story a week. And if someone were to log onto that website now, as I did running up to this, trying to do my research, there's so many stories now. I think I quickly tapped out. So there's no way I'm going to be able to read enough of this to get the run of it. And I followed it since its early days and watched how it kind of took off. And I think and even like watched a community be built around it. I guess or I could say, what is the most like surprising thing, or what was the most reaffirming thing by watching that community kind of rally around the website?
Yeah. Well, it just let us know that there were a lot of people who felt like we did, that there were a lot of, that the rest of the world misunderstood the South and tended to put all Southerners in the same buckets. We were rednecks. We were all conservatives. We were all, mentally challenged in one way or another. And, I think the community came together because there were a lot of people out there who were bothered by that stereotyping. And so they sort of, they wanted to be part of a group of people who were fighting back against that.
Yeah, so at the Global Detail, we're very big on the idea of soft power, which usually comes by way of, like for America, like it's cultural exports. And you famously said that the South is kind of like a gumbo. It's funny. Would you agree, or you want to expound on like how the South for a long time, there seemed to be all these different cultural elements kind of just coming together, creating that gumbo. But on the political level, it seems like there's always this divide where the culture has always been kind of intermingling and kind of sharing. And again, like you said, creating that recipe. But on the political level, it seems like there's this disconnect that people it's like, we like these things, but we don't seem to appreciate how they're made. They always say that politics is downstream of culture, but it seems like in the South, there seems like a bit of a disconnect to that.
I'm honestly not quite sure how to answer that, because I think politics in the South have always been challenging, right?
Yes.
Going all the way back to the beginning of American history, we were the region that fought a war to maintain the institution of slavery, which, is, to any decent person's eyes, that's an abomination, right? But our ancestors fought to maintain the right to own people. Every political evolution that's happened since then has, played out in the South against that backdrop. Political progress was always, I think, more contentious here than probably it was in a lot of other places. I spent a while in the early 1990s working in politics. I was the press secretary to this next to last Democrat governor of Georgia, Zell Miller. And, he was the first governor to attempt to remove the Confederate battle flag from the state flag of Georgia. And I was so proud of it. We gave the speech, to a joint session of the legislature calling for that. But, so many people were resistant to it. We were fed for many years of false version of history. And you can really blame the United Daughters of the Confederacy for that. They were the ones responsible, in the early 1900s for putting up all the monuments to Confederate, quote unquote heroes that, particularly in recent years become so contentious, and many of them have been removed, which is something I agree with. And, the UDC also had a huge influence over the way the history of the South was portrayed in our school books, and we weren't taught a true version of history. So you got a whole region of people who were raised like that, and now we're at a place where that kind of contentiousness and division it's no longer just a Southern thing. It's nationwide, and
you actually are leading into my next question, because I was just saying you've got a lot of experience, you and your comrades at from the Bitter Southerner and Salvation South, of combating false narratives, which we in the South, of
That's
course.
Right.
Which we in the South, of course, know because it's so pervasive down here. The the myth of the great lost cause. But nowadays we have the big lie, or as the media likes to call it, or just about the 2020 election. Someone out there claiming that they won when they really lost, and it's not just a Southern thing; it's everywhere, like you said.
I left the Bitter Southerner because I didn't think we were doing enough to deal with the divisiveness. I think, we had done a good job of debunking stereotypes, yes. But, as we got deeper and deeper into the, Trump's one term as president, it began to occur to me that stereotypes were the least of our damn problems now. The problem was the division between people. And I wanted the Bitter Southerner to try to address the divisiveness more, and I believed that to do that, we needed to invite people of all stripes into the conversation and see what would happen. My partners did not agree with that, and thus I wound up leaving. And a year later, I started Salvation South with the hope that we could do something that would, we could do an online magazine that was aimed at trying to give people some hope and to tell stories that were, giving examples of how healing across the lines of division can actually happen. And I think we've done a pretty good job at that. I mean, one story I like to point to in particular, because I think it really, is one of the top things we've published in terms of being in line with what the goals of Salvation South are, is a story that a writer from originally from Dothan, Alabama, named Charles McNair wrote for us, back in the summer, called The Elephant in the Room. And Charles was part of the first high school class at Dothan High that had been fully integrated all through high school, right? The relationships between the black and white students when they were in school was difficult. The reunions that they had attempted to hold in the intervening years were difficult. He was in the class of 1972. And so this year, 2022, marked the 50th anniversary of their graduation. And Charles and some other and some of his high school classmates came together around this idea that they could actually pull off a reunion where people would actually talk to each other and where hard conversations could happen and perhaps some healing could occur. Now, that seems like a very ambitious, aspiration. But damned if it didn't work, and it was something that gave all the class members of that high school, that high school class, they began to see their old classmates through a new set of eyes, and the ability to tell stories like that and hunt for stories like that, is what I think that we can attribute to it. I don't, it wouldn't have been too difficult for me upon leaving the Bitter Southerner to try to, become even more of a bomb thrower about the political issues today. But God Almighty, it's like, how can a small publication do that and really have any impact? Because the mainstream media delivers divisive, angry content 24/7 these days, right? And, so what we're trying to do at Salvation South is to be an alternative to that. We want to be a website that makes people think, but that also encourages them to respect each other.
So what is the, I guess, the art and the science of that? Because people generally don't like having their worldview or their reality challenged. It's one thing, it needs to be done in a lot of instances. And it's no longer just a Southern problem, but like, how do you do that at the same time and then still create like a welcoming space to have those conversations?
Well, the welcoming space happens by celebrating the culture of the South. Because the thing about it is that people on both sides of the political lines, people on different sides of the racial and ethnic lines, if they were brought up in this region, they're all proud to call themselves Southerner. Every single one of them. So that's why you always see Salvation South doing stuff about so-and-so's grandma's pimento cheese recipe, and that kind of thing, and a lot of the Southern magazines, the traditional ones like Southern Living, have always just been all about, the softer stuff of Southern culture. And what we try to do is to celebrate all that kind of stuff, but mix it in with stories that have, points of view, and the story that will be our lead when we publish this Friday. We publish every Friday. Is a story about the Clotilda. Do you ever hear a boat called the Clotilda?
Can't say that I have.
Okay. In 1808, the United States Congress passed a law banning further importation of slaves. They had decided, well, we have enough, and they banned the importation of more slaves. Well, in the 1850s, a slaver in Mobile, Alabama, decided he would challenge that. And he sent a boat called the Clotilda to what is now the country of Benin in West Africa. And captured people and brought them back to Mobile in 1859, almost a half century after that ban had been passed by Congress. And, got them to Mobile, and what happened was that slavery ended, about 5 years after that boat landed, and the people who had been captives on that boat wound up establishing a self-sustaining Black community called Africatown on Mobile Way. And this Friday night, Netflix is debuting a big documentary about the whole story of Africatown and the Clotilda. And that's called Descendant, and it's coming out on Friday. And, we have a great piece by two journalists, Cynthia Tucker, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and Fry Gaylord, who are both based in Mobile, interviewing descendants of folks who were on that boat and lived in Africatown, and interviewing a guy named Ben Raines, who is a journalist down there and also a diver. And he and a team of people were the ones who actually found the wreckage of the boat back in 2018, which is what, because the fellow who owned the boat, when he got his last gang of slaves to Mobile, ordered that the boat be burned and sunk, destroying the evidence, as it were. And back in 2018, Ben Raines and a team of folks from the University of South Alabama found the wreckage. And, a story like that, it doesn't get in people's face with a particular political point of view, but it asks them to think and to search their hearts really hard about, our history. And I think that's the kind of piece that we do, mixed in with the pimento cheese and the biscuits and all that kind of stuff, that, gives people an interesting publication.
Yeah. You mentioned before you worked for the second to last Democrat governor of Georgia. And I think a lot of people don't know. I was actually looking this up before. I knew that the Democrats had held Georgia for a really long time. But apparently, yeah, but apparently it go from 1872 to 2003. Georgia had nothing but Democrat governors. And I mean, granted, the Democrats evolved a lot in that time, but I think people were so shocked in 2020 that the South went blue, voting for Democrats since, I think the first time they'd voted for a Democrat president since 1992 with Bill Clinton, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe that's right. That is right.
But I mean, yeah, I think going back into the thing that the South is more complex, and people realize that the South voting Democrat is not necessarily a new thing.
No, it's not. Now, you have to acknowledge that the Democratic votes back in the mid-20th century, those were very different kinds of Democrats. They were Dixiecrats. You got to remember that the Republican Party was the party of abolition, of slavery. And it was the Democrats, in the South who tended to fight against civil rights legislation and that kind of stuff. But all of that began to change in the middle of the 20th century, and the way the respective parties look at those issues began to do a big fruit basket turnover until we're in the situation that we're in today, where, the parties do not mirror the way they were 100 years ago at all.
Well, famously, Atlanta used to get referred to on the political map as a blueberry in a bowl of tomato soup. And if you look, at it now like that, now there's a lot more blueberries in that bowl, whereas apparently enough to change. Because if you look at it now, it's all Macon, Albany, Columbus, Augusta, and it apparently got enough of it to now where you can kind of tip the state. But at the same time, there's still a lot of red in there.
Well, and you know, what you're describing is something that we see all over the country these days. You know, the urban areas are blue, the exurbs in the rural areas are red. You know, and it's a phenomenon that has, you know, there's so many forces behind that, and you know, it's a very complex and difficult thing to understand. You know, and I'm not saying I have a particularly brilliant way of understanding it. You know, what I'm doing and what we're trying to do with Salvation South is to just, you know, figure out how to be decent people in a world like that without getting involved in the daily mudslinging. Because I don't see any, you know, good in us engaging in that. There are plenty of other people engaging in that these days. And we want to be a place where our place is trying something different.
As someone who's an outsider to both the North and the South of the United States, it's been fascinating having an outside view looking in. Particularly, I just want to touch on what you mentioned about Dixiecrats, and Brandon and I waxed lyrical about, you know, blueberry nut tomato soup, and I happened to be in Georgia when the runoffs were going on, so it was fascinating looking at this. I suppose if you had to phrase this in a very simplistic way, the Republican Party being the party of abolitionists and the Democrats being the pro-slavery party, it's fascinating how the Democrats went from KKK to Obama and the Republicans went from Lincoln to Trump. Perhaps this is my first part. How would you categorize, I'm talking about 100-year, 150-year political history in the short time that we have here? Where did it happen? I mean, because 65 has been that inflection point when LBJ passed the Civil Rights Law into motion, and the famous speech saying that we had the South for a generation. So how did this flip over happen?
Well, I do think that what happened in the 60s was the most important inflection point in that whole sweep of history that you're describing. You know, because it was a very focused battle then. You know, it was, do people of color deserve to be treated equally? Should they be able to vote with the same ease of all other people? You know, should they be able to participate in a society that isn't separate but equal, which was never equal in the first place, or in the society, participate in the one American society as equals, right? And we're still fighting a lot of those battles today. I think so much of, you know, no one wants to say it out loud, but, you know, there are a lot of folks out there who lack tolerance on issues of race. You know, they don't want, you know, and I don't know what they're afraid of. You know, I look at this, you know, what do they call it? The replacement theory or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and I see the people who adhere to that as just nuts. But, you know, they're scared. You know, and I it's hard to get over a bridge like that, man.
Well, you have surprised everyone in all your years of watching politics and Republican politics and Southern politics at the way 2016 went, because Trump's Republican predecessor was Romney as a candidate. And today he's seen as the saner voice. Back then he was seen as one of the most dangerous voices in 2012. Did that catch you by surprise as well, just given how caustic and acerbic?
Did 2016 catch me by surprise?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to admit it did, you know, because in retrospect, I feel like I shouldn't have been surprised, because in Trump, you had a politician who was willing to say out loud the vile things that reside in the hearts of many people, but they were afraid to say them out loud. He was able to win a lot of people to his side. Just, because, we heard it over and over and over again, He says what he thinks, That's why I love the guy. So, yeah, I was surprised by that. And, I thought and I had hoped that we were past the days when that kind of behavior was acceptable. But I think there was a lot of latent demand, the economists would say, for that kind of political speech, and we're still figuring out how to get beyond it.
Well, I've heard people characterize the fight nowadays as it's not just red versus blue, but it's kind of like it's urban and maybe suburban versus rural.
I believe that's right. And I think that's reflected in what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Where you see these, blue dots in vast expanses of red when you look at the political map. It's, I think that people who gravitate to urban areas tend to be more open-minded about other people. I don't know exactly how to explain that. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I don't completely understand it, but I think it's true.
Well, that kind of takes me back to my earlier question. People, even people in small towns love going to like Mexican restaurants or Chinese restaurants. So I guess the big question is like, how do we bridge that gap from these people who still live in small towns that maybe aren't as ethnically diverse? It's certainly nowhere near as diverse as maybe like a big city. But how do you get them to that place where they can be open, where suddenly looking at the demographic shift, that doesn't scare the hell out of them, like you get like some of the famous politicians preaching the replacement theory. You're like, no, it's not this drastic thing where everyone's coming to come and kick you out of your community, and that you get to be a part of it. When they say diversity, if you're a Southerner, you get to be a part of it. You're still part of the gumbo. It's not like anyone's kicking you out.
Yeah. Right. And I just think it happens slowly over time, Brandon. I've seen it happen in my hometown where, when I was young, a lot of migrant workers from Mexico were beginning to, come in seasonally to harvest crops and then more and more of them just stayed and made a home there. And the community has adapted to that change, and I think, I don't know. Looking at things like that, kind of keeps me thinking positive. It's like, we may not see it happen in our lifetimes, completely. But I think as time passes and people are just put in situations, because it's happening in rural areas, increasingly, like it happens in urban areas, where people do live together and work together, and they have to figure out a way to live with each other, and I think the more that happens and the more time passes, the closer we'll be to a point where the country no longer feels so divided. At least that's my hope. I pray for that all the time.
So is the answer just kind of like doing the work like Salvation South is doing, and just kind of luring people in with that cultural appreciation and then allowing them space to kind of have those conversations? I love this quote. This, I think, is called like the Stonecutter's Creed. It says where he talks about like when he on the 100th hit that the stone finally breaks. I know that it wasn't that particular hit, but all the hits that went before. That when we get to that place where we all want to be, it'll have been hopefully like people like yourself and Salvation South and then the others just doing that work and just kind of letting time kind of sort it out. Do you feel like that's really the only way forward?
I kind of do. And I know it might feel to some people like I'm copping out when I say that. You know, there are a lot of people in, more favor of radical action. Good moral people must absolutely stand their ground and defend their positions. But I think time is just an essential part of the process. When you've lived as long as I have, you really start to see how slowly society changes. Every now and then we make these great leaps forward, and then feels like we're pushed back, but it's always evolving. It's always getting different, and I hope that keeps happening, and I hope it tends toward the good. It's you go back to, as I often do, to the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think those words feel truer to me now than they ever have at any point in my life before. They give me hope.
Yeah, I mean, it's I've said it to people. I mean, it's I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories where some old racist Southern granddaddy suddenly meets his half black grandchild, and suddenly just over time, at first there's resistance, but then they change. And little stories like that I've seen even in my hometown. I remember when I was growing up, if a white and black person dated, it was the talk of the town. And now I've seen interracial couples just walk through like it's nothing. Like even where I can walk through with my wife, who's South Asian, and nobody really seems to bat an eye. Or at least if they are, they're not going to be openly rude about it, as they might have been at one point in time. So
I see that in my hometown too. It's, things change over time. And I think, in general, they change for the better. We may be living in a period right now where it doesn't feel like that, but I think if you hang on a while longer, it'll start to feel more like that. At least I hope so.
And with that, we bring this episode to a close. If you like what you're hearing, kindly give us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell a friend. So until next time, on The Global Detail. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. All guest views are their own. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2022 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.